So, as you all might have heard, I've actually done quite a lot of presentations, and I'm frequently told that I should start off with a story. So our story today is about loss. It's about $5 billion of loss. Now, I work for Microsoft's Public Sector Services, which means that we're talking about loss from the U.S. government. For those of you in the U.S., that is $5 billion of your tax dollars lost. It's not a great story, but it does have a bit of a happy ending. But one of the interesting things with losing $5 billion is just how many projects you get. You'd think for $5 billion we would get a tremendous amount of software. That you would not only get software, but you see a tremendous amount of value for the software that you receive. Well, unfortunately, as it turns out, we're just going to talk about 6. It was 6 projects that added up excuse me, to the $5 billion loss. All of these 6 projects had the money put into them, had work done, and had managed to not actually deliver anything. Now, there was documentation, there was lots of meetings, plenty of people employed. Nonetheless, they never actually turned out software, at least before I got to them. Now, these are 6 carefully selected projects. I wanted to show that over the span of events, really everything fails. Whether you're really small at a mere $15 million, or you're relatively large at $100 million, and that's actually kind of real money, or maybe even over $2 billion. All of these projects used a variety of technologies. They had large teams. They were rigorously managed, and they were all locked into some methodology. But all of them, regardless of size, managed to suffer the same basic failings. Oddly enough, they had issues with, well, leadership. The leadership involved in these projects were good at what they were managing, but weren't good at managing the work. They all had communication problems. Frequently, I would go into sites where people actually knew what was wrong, but they weren't being listened to. And last, they tend to be staffed poorly. And that's not in terms of numbers. It's in terms of specific skills relating to both the business that they're trying to deal with, as well as the technologies that have been selected at that time. So these 3 things, from 6 very large projects, spanning a wide array of possibilities, draw together a very common scenario. Well, this scenario plays out, our $5 billion of failing projects. As it turns out, all the best practices in the world weren't saving them. $5 billion worth of projects, as it turns out, can be saved for a whopping $425 million. In and of itself, also not a big number, but an order of magnitude less than what was spent getting up to the point where they were clearly failing. An order of magnitude to actually decrease their staff size, to actually review the problems at hand, and to actually turn this thing around so that we were delivering real product to real people who were better off receiving the software at the end of the day. So that is how we define actual success, software in the hands of users. So how do you go from out of control to in control? It's kind of a funny question to ask when we're talking about best practices. In theory, best practices are how you stay in control. But it's not what's going to save you this time. Frequently, what we see are people who are in the exact same situation but respond to problems differently. You may remember a few years back a pilot who had problems with engine failure over the Hudson. They managed to correct things and save everybody aboard to land on the river. There are many reported cases of pilots with similar outages who have complete and epic failure. Same can be said for ships. Some approach a rocky coast and go ashore. Some of them manage to stay perfectly afloat, even in storms. So the question is, in our environment, that of IT, how do you go from out of control to in control? So I propose it's really a mixed answer. There's 3 basic steps: clear recognition, good decision-making, and decisive action. We're going to go through all 3 of these individually, but what really is important here is frequently we have people who can recognize they're in trouble. And less frequently, but often, they'll make good decisions, certainly good decisions within the framework of the best practices they have at hand. But what's really hard, and what happens the least, is for people to actually take opinion and experience, I'd say decisive action trumps the other two, because even bad decision-making with decisive action gives you a change. If you're in trouble, change needs to happen. For this to work out well, you really need to have a baseline of your project. And what I'm showing on the screen right now is sort of a notional project. From left to right, it proceeds over time. And from bottom to top, it becomes more and more complete. It's a fairly classic tale, and if you have a baseline, this is the kind of baseline you usually set in place. When problems come along, they tend to mess up your baseline. Projects I frequently see start out really well, they staff well, they get all their environments straight. They hit a bit of a plateau, and then there is this epic and sudden downturn. What's interesting is when they reach the baseline line, there was no correction made to try to turn things around. Instead, what they do is they continue to do what they've been doing, and it drives it further and further away from the baseline, in this case, a negative direction. What we really need to see is as you approach the baseline, either from the bottom or the top, you make corrections. Oddly enough, most best practices talk about staying on the baseline and consider all positives good, but as it turns out, really big vacillation is just as bad going up as it is going down. But back to the original point, we want to talk about this selective view of the world, right? Is it true that selective practices can improve clear recognition? Now, this is a premise, and one I hope to prove over the next 25, 30 minutes, that if we can see things for what they are, not just what we think they should be, we'll be better off for it. As an example, a couple of my favorite treats. If this were a live session, I'd be asking people to identify these, but as a webinar, let me just tell you, this is a bagel and a donut. A bagel and a donut are very, very similar. They're basically the same ingredients in different proportions, and they're handled somewhat differently. It's the same activities under different contexts, and you get very, very different things. One's a tasty treat. The other one is sort of a hearty meal. I happen to like them both any time of the day. But having that clear recognition is what allows us to move forward. Now, in the real world, any given methodology has a set of practices, and the actual application of any individual practice tends to vary. It can vary along the sequence of those practices, as in the baking of a donut versus a bagel. It can vary along the materials applied to those practices, as in which tools you use or who's got the skills, or any number of other conditions. To make sure that this premise wasn't completely insane, I was actually part of the conducting of a study with another gentleman named Will Money. And we actually sent out a survey to over 1,300 people. And we asked a very specific set of questions, one of which was, there are different objectives and perceived effects of various practices under varying situations. And you can see that there was a pretty strong agreement to this, that overall, people, nearing 100% of people, believed that different practices netted different results. And that was a very interesting thing for us to find, because we really expected people to feel more consistent about their practices, that if they did it every time, they would get the same thing. So I went on to create what is sort of an artificial scale, certainly a work in progress, that talks about an individual practice's impact on the overall project. Any given practice can actually do damage as much as help. The scale goes from 0 to 10, both up and down, and allows you to look at the implications of doing something in your environment, on your project, with your people, and in your context. Now, the scale can be a little daunting, and I've had several